Jonathan, so I thought I could start with talking about why in Australia we seem so obsessed with coal, and we wave it around in Parliament and we don't talk about renewables.
Yeah.
Do you have a clue why?
Well, I think there's a lot of reasons that Australia's been really slow to shift to renewables and embrace renewables. Part of it is a political system that's been very heavily captured by the resource sector. So mining companies wield a lot of influence over the political establishment, and I think we saw that most clearly when the Labor Party attempted to introduce a mining like a super profits tax on the mining companies. And for once, the mining companies realised that our big donations and our internal lobbying isn't buying us enough influence over the Labor Party. So they just redirected that money to a public campaign and ran this huge scare campaign that basically terrified the Labor Party, almost lost them government. And kind of since that point in 2010, it's been really hard to get either the Labor Party or the Liberal Party to seriously rethink a drastic shift away from fossil fuel industries. And so I think that's a big part of it. It's just the amount of influence that the companies themselves exert. But it's also about a very adversarial political system that doesn't create the space for new ideas to come to the fore and for evidence-based decision making to kind of dominate. So instead of, like, too often political decisions are made based on emotional campaigns and like the noisy minority from a few key interest groups rather than what's best for the society's long-term interests. So I think it's both the direct fact that mining corporations exert a lot of influence over the political system, but also a broader problem with Australian politics that just shuts out new ideas.
Where do you see Australia going with renewables in the future? Because it's not even being talked about at all.
Yeah, so
nowhere near enough. Certainly not like a lot of other countries.
No, and I think we've squandered this amazing opportunity because, particularly in Queensland, we have an amazing abundance of solar energy that we could be capturing and using. We also have huge opportunities with wind power, with thermal, like even hydropower, wave power. There are all these options out there, and it's kind of bizarre that Queensland's been so slow to embrace them. I hope, or my vision is that we can transition pretty quickly to 100% renewable energy generation. The research has been done, the work's out there. Any number of independent organisations have demonstrated quite clearly that it's possible. The problem really seems to be one of political will. So probably the more interesting question is, what kind of energy network are we looking at? Do we imagine giant solar power plants out in the desert feeding the cities, or are we looking more like a distributed network where people are generating solar energy and other forms of renewable energy on their own properties and either feeding that back into the grid or feeding that locally into community-owned power networks? So there's been a lot of interesting work around community-owned solar power plants that aren't this sort of massive for-profit enterprise, but local co-ops where you buy enough panels for a large roof space and then collectively generate energy for yourselves. And so I think that's kind of the more interesting question. It's not will we shift to renewables. We will eventually, and we definitely need to. The question is, will our network still be heavily controlled by a few big companies, or will it be controlled by ordinary users?
Yeah, there's a lot. Yeah, there's especially in England, there's a lot of crowd-funded community groups.
Yeah,
and they've raised £1 million, and they've installed wind turbines or even solar parks, because that does work in England as well. Solar is like 80% efficient in England.
Yeah, right.
And we're in Brisbane, and actually solar panels are less efficient here than they are in Victoria. It's just too hot.
Yeah,
so
right.
they lose a lot of efficiency, but they're still very useful, of course.
Yeah.
What kind of transport would you say would be ideal in Brisbane? Not just in electric cars, but say I suppose the buses too, and the motorbikes and that sort of thing. Do you think we should be using more motorbikes, and what incentives should we use for these bits of transport? Like buses, should they be cheaper? Actually, are there any subsidies for people, for bus companies to be cheap? There are in England, for example.
I could go on a long rant about urban transport in Brisbane. I think the first point to recognise is that Brisbane has been designed as a sprawling city, but commerce is still heavily concentrated in the CBD. So we've created this system where somehow commuters have to get in and out of the CBD every day. And a lot of the focus, whether it's on private vehicle transport or on public transport, has been how do we ferry masses of people in and out of the centre, when actually what we should probably also be doing is focusing more on shifting towards walkable neighbourhoods, decentralised commercial nodes, and kind of what London has in a way, where you have your local high street and a lot of people work and engage there rather than heading all the way into the centre. And so part of the solution to transport is actually in urban planning and land use, and ensuring that there are commercial and industrial work opportunities near to residential opportunities. But putting that aside, I think the shift will have to be, and the focus will have to be on active transport and public transport rather than just on cars. Even if we shift to sort of self-driving electric vehicles that are both far better for the environment and are also much more efficient in terms of how they use road space, there still comes a point where you just can't, in terms of the practical space implications, accommodate the volumes of passengers we need to if one or two people are travelling in each car. So definitely need to be looking more at mopeds, scooters, motorbikes, and shifting substantially towards better cycling infrastructure so more people can ride their bikes. But there will just be a really big role to play for public transport. There will be trains and buses and city cats near the river, and more of a focus not just on the in and out of the city, but those inter-suburb connections that Brisbane really lacks at the moment. So like a lot of cities, we've gone down this path of very car-centric development, and simply shifting from petrol cars to electric cars isn't going to deal with those deeper issues of congestion and mobility.
Yeah, and I think there are too many cars in Brisbane, and I think if we used, say, autonomous vehicles, like they're testing this in Perth at the minute, that would be really good. I think 90% of the time, 90% of the world's cars aren't being driven. They're just parked up.
It's bizarre.
And you know.
Oh, the amount of car parking space that's wasted in the inner city is crazy. Like, you look around and you see how much valuable inner city real estate that could be used for housing or green space or any number of community purposes is instead just wasted on car storage. And it basically amounts to a massive subsidy of motorists at the expense of residents who don't drive as often. And I think people forget that Brisbane wasn't always a car-centric city. There's this sort of very short-term memory about Brisbane where we forget that 50, 100 years ago, lots of people were travelling by trams and by buses and trains and riding and walking to work. And it's only sort of since the 1940s and 50s that we've really shifted to southeast Queensland becoming so car dominated. So there's no reason we can't shift back again. And actually the technology now makes it much easier to do that. Yeah.
If you look at Denmark in Copenhagen, 1 in 2 people who go into the city, to go to commute to work in the morning, they walk or ride the pushbike. Do you think that's even a little bit possible in Brisbane in the next 10 years? It's
totally possible if we get all our ducks in a row, and that's the public transport and the cycling infrastructure and the footpath infrastructure, but it's also, like I said, about urban planning, so that people live closer to where they work, and that you don't have to drive to the mega mall every weekend for your shopping, that there are small local businesses that you can stop off at your way home from work to pick up a few things each day. And so we need to rethink consumer habits, we need to rethink urban planning. There are all these different aspects that we'd have to get right to shift to a different sort of transport system. But if the political will is there, it can happen very, very quickly. And that's the important thing we keep forgetting, is that we have the technology, we have the resources, we have the know-how, we just lack the political will. And currently what I see as a local councillor in Brisbane is that the majority of councillors still have a very car-centric mentality. Even the active travel targets that they set in their long-term plans are incredibly unambitious. They simply do not in their hearts believe that it's possible for the majority of Brisbaneites to travel by buses and bikes and walking. They just can't get their heads around that. Because they drive, and that's the world they know, and they're not often prompted to think outside the box. And even talking about targets of sort of 50 or 60% public transport and active transport, they think that's wildly utopian and unrealistic, which is so disappointing when so many other cities are already doing that. Yeah.
Do you think there are any sort of benefits that people might not immediately think of if Australia had more renewables? So if it was, say, 25% renewable, what are some benefits that people might get without realising it?
Energy would be cheaper. I think that is the biggest myth that prevails in Australian society, is this idea that fossil fuel, burning coal, etc., ends up being cheaper than renewable energy. But when you add in all the externalities, when you look at all the massive subsidies that the coal industry receives, actually it's not cheaper or more efficient. It's just heavily, heavily subsidised in terms of the road infrastructure that we build to these mining projects, in terms of the tax concessions and royalty discounts. We give the resources industry so much, we give the fossil fuel industry so much in terms of tax concessions and discounts, and they still are struggling to be financially competitive. So I think that needs to be one of the messages that comes to the fore more clearly, is that renewable energy is actually cheaper if you take the profiteering out of the sector, if you take out the middlemen from the electricity retailing industry. Another big benefit, I think, which particularly around vehicle transport, is obviously emissions and air pollution. And so like switching to electric vehicles and switching away from fossil fuels isn't just about stopping climate change, it's also just about having a cleaner local environment where the air is purer and people don't have as many respiratory issues, and people who live along main roads don't have like a thick layer of dust on all their windows. Like that's sort of those sorts of smaller amenity issues don't get talked about enough. And probably as well as that, like I could go on all day about the negative environmental impacts of coal mining, the loss of farmland, the degradation of groundwater. The list goes on and on and on. So shifting to renewables isn't just about, hey, we're doing a good thing to stop climate change. It's about more efficiently using resources, cheaper electricity and better prices for consumers, better environmental outcomes both locally and globally. And in some senses, democratizing our whole economic and energy system, because we have such a centralized grid that's where most of the power is within the hands of a few big energy retailers. Consumers don't have much choice, and they don't have so they have these really high costs that then cripple them in other ways, and because their cost of living is so high, they have less time for engaging with community movements and political engagement and like getting to know your neighbours. All those little things that come from having a high cost of living flow from, in part, a shitty energy system and a crappy transport system.
If we had a renewable energy system here and it was 100% renewable, I think the cost should be about half what it would be at current.
Yeah, and it depends entirely on whose data you use.
That's without subsidies.
Yeah.
That's without any subsidies going to renewables at all.
Yeah, there's so many conflicting sources of information now, and like everyone can quote statistics to back up their own line of argument. But you just have to look at what other countries are doing. Like it's not hypothetical or theoretical. This stuff is already happening in different cities and countries around the world.
Yeah.
And so the evidence is there on the ground.
Yeah, there's a very quick Google. So in September, the government announced that they would offer a discount on interest rates for people who want to buy an electric vehicle, and they would knock off 0.5% off of the interest. That's not enough, is it? That's not an incentive for people to buy electric cars. They also give you in Australia $100 off of registration annually, which is nothing. When you consider in Norway, they don't charge any tax to import an electric vehicle, but they charge 100% on any fossil fuel burning car. In other developed countries that are similar, Britain or Norway or America, they let you use bus lanes, they let you park cars for free, they don't charge any registration. You can use ferries for cheaper in Norway, for example. Right. So in Norway, 42% of car sales in August this year were electric cars. New car sales, 42%. In England, it was 2.1%. Here, it was 0.01%.
It's a joke, isn't it?
Which is that's scary. That's not even 0.5% or 1%. And that's not good. It's 0.01%. That's terrible.
And I think all those incentives show, that example shows that incentives do make a difference, and those tax incentives, if we had them here, would probably help to shift a large number of consumers. But we also have to think about it from a social justice and equity perspective. And one possible future is that we end up in a world where the very wealthy can afford really efficient electric cars, and the poor are taxed more heavily because their cars are high fossil fuel emitting and also have higher running costs with petrol, etc. And so maybe one of the questions we need to be asking ourselves, and this is one of the trickier ones that I don't think many people in Australia spend much time thinking about, is our vision of the future of transport in Brisbane, is it that everyone owns and drives an electric car, or is it that we have cheap or even free, universal, accessible public transport? And probably we have to talk more about electric buses and how we can make public transport cheaper and easier to use, rather than just focusing all our energy on how can we make it easier for the upper middle class to buy electric cars. We've got to do a bit of both, obviously, but I don't think it's enough to say that, we'll reduce this tax and we'll have this incentive so that more people can buy electric cars, when the poorest people in our society could never dream of buying a new car anyway. So it's and it's obviously also worth thinking about the fact that new cars, whether they're petrol or electric still have a high resource burden. And some of the components in new electric cars are like quite rare metals that have problems with the supply chains and the ethics of the mining companies overseas, etc. So holding electric cars up as a solution is probably not the right approach. They're one piece of a complex puzzle, but I think public transport and walkable neighbourhoods are probably a bigger focus, or need to be a bigger focus.
Yeah, I think people need to realise that no car is green. You can't have a green car. And so
Well
people,
said.
I don't think people buy Teslas or Nissan Leafs and sort of advocate that they're green people. And I think the biggest three things that you have for creating your carbon footprint is how you power your house, how you drive to work, or how do you get to work, and what food you eat. And so 51% of your carbon footprint comes from what food you eat.
Yeah.
So that's why a lot of vegans are green people.
Yeah, I've heard that stat before. Yeah, and again, it's the thing with this, like, because there's all this conflicting data about how much, what volume of resources is consumed in manufacturing a new car versus retrofitting an older car, for example. And there's obviously a lot more profit to be made from selling new electric cars. But is there an argument that we should instead be focusing more resources and more of our energy on retrofitting older vehicles and making them more sustainable, because the net impact on non-renewable resources is actually better if we just don't use all that metal and all those electrical components to build a whole new vehicle. Yeah, it's tricky stuff.
Yeah, it's tricky stuff. I wonder in Brisbane how we could. It seems here, a lot of people need to or decide to use a car just to go and get anything. If they want some milk, they get in the car and they drive to the shop. And how could we make it so that it's not like that, especially when it's hot, and it's really hot. And that's not just Brisbane, but Brisbane is particularly hot, but in other parts of Australia. How can we encourage people to maybe just take the bus? Are there enough buses on the road, do you think? Because if we just sort of manage to create a future where there's a lot less cars and more buses, would it be doable without altering the roads to have enough routes so that people could just not get in a car to get a bit of milk?
So it's amazing in Brisbane, like when you look at the map of the transport network, some areas are really well serviced by public transport, have high frequency routes. You can literally step outside your door and be in the city within 10 or 15 minutes. And then other areas are just a black hole where you have to walk for kilometres just to find a bus stop, and then it only comes once every hour and you're still paying $5. And so like, we have a very unequal, poorly distributed transport network, and so it's hard to generalise about the whole city. But there are a few very simple things that City Council could be doing immediately at relatively low cost to start shifting the system. One of those is simply to reduce speed limits on a lot of roads, and that would make the pedestrian environment much more safe and comfortable. And so a lot of parents at the moment are choosing to drive their kids to school because they don't feel safe letting their kids walk to school. A lot of people, they're not comfortable walking on a busy, noisy road where trucks are roaring past and the fumes are intense. But if we slow our streets down, it makes it not only more comfortable for pedestrians, but a lot safer for cyclists in particular. So that doesn't cost much. It's literally just putting in a few signs, start enforcing lower speed limits. Over time, behaviour shifts. And that's one of the changes that's not talked about as much. We talk a lot about bike lanes and hard infrastructure, but simply lowering speed limits and changing motorist expectations has a big impact. Another thing that the council can and should be doing is introducing more transit lanes and bus priority lanes. So we had a bit of a burst of transit lanes and bus lanes like 10 or 12 years ago. There was a political backlash from like a vocal minority of privileged motorists basically who didn't like sitting in traffic watching poor people on the bus overtake them effectively. And in response to that, Conservative councillors removed a lot of bus lanes and sort of withdrew support for transit lanes. But we could very quickly change that, and just like on all major roads, if there's more than one lane, one of the lanes just becomes a T3 lane or a bus priority lane. Suddenly buses and carpooling will become the fastest ways to travel around the city, and people will respond in kind. So again, a low cost solution doesn't take much money or much effort to implement, but would have a significant impact on the convenience of public transport. And that's really what it comes down to. For some people, the barrier is price. For some people, the barrier is convenience. So we have to deal with both of those. But to improve the convenience of public transport, just giving buses priority on a lot of main roads goes a long way. And the third thing, which we're still not doing enough of, is repurposing street car parking for either bike lanes or green boulevards. So everyone talks about, okay, if we made our streets shadier and leafier, it'd be way more comfortable for pedestrians. People would be happy to walk further and walk to the bus stop, etc., etc. Trees need root space. They like, it's not just about how much space they take up above the ground, it's all the infrastructure they're interfering under the ground. And in inner cities, you have like a lot of underground services, pipes, electrical cables, phone cables. So you can't just whack trees in everywhere. But if you start repurposing a bit of the road corridor, and often there's a lot of dead space that's used for street parking, and use that for planting up trees, you're narrowing the road corridor, which will also help to slow cars down. You're creating more space for pedestrians and cyclists, and you're also making the streets greener and more comfortable for pedestrians. So in some cases, repurposing car spaces for trees and footpaths makes a lot of sense. In other cases, repurposing street parking for bike lanes would make a huge difference. And it's bizarre. I still hear the Lord Mayor in Brisbane say, "Oh, Brisbane's not like some cities. We have very narrow roads here," and that just boggles my mind, because actually Brisbane has very wide roads.
I think so.
Yeah,
a narrow lane.
No, it's bizarre. There are a few parts of the inner city where, sure, some of the old roads are a bit narrow, but like the vast majority of Brisbane roads are quite broad and have a lot of space on the shoulders to throw in separated bike lanes or to throw in more trees and green space. But again, it comes back to political priorities, and we still have this mentality that within our council that says, "Oh, we'd like to support active transport and we'd like to support greener streets, but our most important priority is maximising traffic flow." And so any project that's proposed, any idea or novel solution is still analysed through that lens of, will this increase travel times for private motorists? And if it will, they barely look at it. And so that's kind of the big problem, is that they like the sound of all these other ideas, but they don't want to slow down cars. And until that shifts, we're going to be stuck in this rut that we're in at the moment.
Yeah, the people in the government seem to say a lot of things, but a lot of it just seems like jargon. How can people get things to change? Because if we just leave the system as it is, I don't think much is going to change in the future, or at least quickly. So how can the average people in society just sort of make things change? Who can we complain to or speak to? What can we do?
It depends a lot on the issue, and I spend a lot of time thinking about the best avenues and levers for political change. When there are big corporate interests that have a sort of a vested interest in maintaining the status quo, expecting that your MPs are going to respond to signatures and petitions and letter writing campaigns is a bit naive, because the influence of the corporate sector is so much stronger than the influence of voters, except perhaps in a few marginal seats. So if you're in a marginal seat where a poly's really nervous about losing their seat, petitions and letter writing campaigns and public protests can sometimes make a bit of a difference. But on any issue where the corporate sector doesn't want things to change, they'll go out of their way to heavily lobby councillors. But with something like the transport networks, and particularly it's like bike lanes, there aren't huge vested corporate interests stacked against shifting to a more sustainable transport network. The problem there is really a lack of political imagination. And in that context, I think more residents contacting their local councillors, more residents signing petitions, more residents turning up to protests in favour of bike lanes or in favour of cheaper public transport actually will make a difference. So it depends very much on the issue. So something like shifting to renewable energy, challenging the coal lobby through petitions and letter writing campaigns, waste of time. Our best strategy in that context is to lock onto coal trucks and blockade coal mines, etc. But for something like getting more bike lanes in the inner city, a few meetings with MPs and councillors will actually go a long way to shifting the political conversation. Unfortunately, people just feel powerless. We have a system that is so often reinforces the idea that you're not being listened to and politicians don't care, which means that even when there is an opportunity and politicians maybe do care a little bit, we don't bother engaging with them. And I think on active transport and shifting to sustainable public transport networks in cities like Brisbane, there is an opening there if enough people lobby and advocate strongly.
Yeah, cool. That's good. We should wrap it up there.
Yeah, good chat.
Yeah, thanks for the time.
Nice, thanks for having me.
Yeah, thank you.